They told me I would lose everything if I spoke the truth. And they were right. But what I gained was far greater than anything I lost. My name is Dr. Farhad Nouri. And that was me on the morning of 18th April, 2024. I stood at the podium in Azadi Square, Tehran, staring at over 150,000 Iranians packed shoulder to shoulder across the massive plaza, with another 500,000 watching the live broadcast on state television and online. Military helicopters hovered overhead, their blades chopping the air into rhythmic warnings. The sun blazed mercilessly, but no one moved. All eyes were fixed on me. I was dressed in my traditional clerical robes, the dark fabric marking my position within the Council of Public Guidance, the embroidered details signaling my 3 decades of service to the Islamic Republic. As one of the most senior religious scholars in Iran, I was expected to deliver a speech that would strengthen national unity, reinforce religious loyalty, and quiet the whispers of spiritual unrest spreading across the country. Instead, I gripped the edges of the podium with trembling hands, looked past the prepared script lying before me, and said the words that would destroy my reputation, endanger my life, and shift the trajectory of a nation. People of Iran. I was asked to speak about strength. But today, I speak about peace. I am 58 years old, born into a family of respected clerics, whose lineage traces back generations in service to Islam. I have dedicated my entire adult life to studying Islamic theology, teaching in the holy city of Qom, and rising through the ranks of Iran's religious establishment. I currently chair the Council of Public Guidance, a powerful body responsible for shaping the moral and spiritual direction of the nation. I also advise senior government officials on matters of religious law, and my sermons are broadcast into millions of homes across the country. For over 30 years, I have been one of the most trusted and influential voices in the Iranian religious hierarchy. My fatwas settle disputes. My teachings are quoted in academic circles. My opinions shape government decisions. I live in a secure residential compound in northern Tehran, travel with armed security escorts, and have access to resources and privileges that ordinary Iranians will never know. By every worldly measure, I am successful, powerful, and untouchable. But on the inside, I have been empty for longer than I can remember. I was born into this life of religious authority. My father was a distinguished imam in Tehran, known for his eloquent sermons and his unwavering commitment to the revolution. My grandfather was a cleric who helped establish Islamic governance in our region after 1979. From the time I was a small boy, I was told that leadership was my destiny, that our family carried a sacred responsibility, and that I was being prepared for greatness in service to Allah and the Islamic Republic. I had no say in the matter. My future was decided before I understood what it meant. I was sent to religious school at the age of 8, memorizing the Quran in classical Arabic, even though I spoke Farsi at home. I learned to recite prayers 5 times a day, to observe every fast and festival with perfect precision, to follow every rule and ritual without question. I was taught that Islam was the complete and final revelation from Allah, that obedience was the highest virtue, and that doubt was the whisper of the devil. I was an exceptional student, always first in my class, always praised by my teachers. I could recite entire surahs from memory by the time I was 13. I could debate complex points of Islamic jurisprudence with scholars twice my age. My instructors told my father that I would one day become one of the great voices of our generation. I absorbed their praise like oxygen, and worked even harder to prove myself worthy of their expectations. By my 20s, I had completed advanced studies in theology and was teaching at religious seminaries. By my 30s, I was delivering Friday sermons that drew thousands. By my 40s, I had security details, government access, and a reputation that opened every door. Outwardly, I was everything a religious leader should be: disciplined, knowledgeable, respected, feared. Inwardly, I was a man going through the motions of a faith that had become performance. Every prayer felt rehearsed. Every sermon sounded like an echo of something I'd said 100 times before. Every night, I lay awake in my comfortable home, surrounded by books and accolades, wondering why, after decades of devotion, my soul still felt restless. I preached peace to others, yet I carried tension in my chest. I taught certainty from the pulpit, yet I lived with questions I could never voice. I spoke about the nearness of God, yet he felt distant as the stars. But doubt was dangerous. In my position, even curiosity could destroy you. So I buried it. I performed my duties. I maintained appearances. I told myself that this emptiness was the cost of leadership, that spiritual dryness was a test of faithfulness. I had no idea that everything was about to change. It started quietly, the way earthquakes begin deep underground before anyone feels the shaking. In late 2023, strange reports began crossing my desk. Intelligence units flagged unusual patterns, students quietly leaving mosques, families gathering in private apartments, professionals whispering about experiences they couldn't explain. The authorities called it religious contamination. They wanted it investigated, contained, and eliminated. But what disturbed me wasn't the numbers. It was the pattern. These weren't people being persuaded by arguments or recruited by organizations. They were encountering something, or someone. Taxi drivers described a figure in white calling them by name in the middle of the night. University students dreamed of forgiveness that felt heavier than condemnation. Former soldiers spoke of rage dissolving into peace overnight, without explanation. These weren't emotional, unstable people. They were logical, educated, grounded in reality. Yet all of them described the same presence. Jesus. My duty was to investigate, to analyze the threat, to discredit the testimonies and restore order. So I did what I was trained to do: interrogate, dismiss, report. Then I met Arman. And nothing was ever the same again. To understand why meeting Arman shattered everything I thought I knew, you need to understand the world I had built, and the cracks that were already forming beneath the surface. I come from a family where faith wasn't chosen. It was inherited like land or titles. My great-grandfather was among the first clerics to establish religious schools in Tehran after the Constitutional Revolution. My grandfather served as an influential imam who helped shape the Islamic Republic's early theological framework. My father continued that legacy, building a reputation as a scholar whose interpretations of Sharia law were quoted in courtrooms and referenced in government chambers. By the time I was born, the Nouri name already carried weight. Expectations came before I could walk. I don't remember a childhood where I was simply Farhad. I was always the Nouri boy, the next generation, the one who will carry the legacy forward. My father used to place his hand on my head after prayers and say, "You will be greater than me. This is your calling." I believed him because I had no other option. At 8 years old, while other boys played soccer in the streets, I sat cross-legged in dimly lit study rooms, memorizing verses in a language that didn't flow naturally from my tongue. Arabic was sacred. Farsi was common. So I learned to think in someone else's words. By 13, I could recite the entire Quran without looking at the page. My teachers called it miraculous. I called it survival. Because failure wasn't just disappointing, it was unthinkable. The path was laid out with perfect clarity: memorize, master, rise, led. And I followed it with precision. At 16, I was sent to Qom, the spiritual heart of Shia scholarship, where the best minds in Islamic theology debated and taught. I thrived there, not because I loved it, but because I was built for it. I could dissect arguments, recite precedents, win debates before my opponents finished their opening statements. My professors praised me constantly. Senior clerics invited me to private study sessions. By my mid-20s, I was teaching seminars that attracted students from across the country. Then came the appointments. First, a position on the Regional Religious Council. Then, invitations to advise government officials on Islamic law. By my 30s, I was delivering Friday sermons broadcast nationwide. By my 40s, I had security escorts, a guarded residence, and access to rooms where national decisions were made. People bowed when I entered. My words ended arguments. My fatwas settled disputes that courts couldn't resolve. I had become exactly what my family prepared me to be. Powerful. Respected. Untouchable. But somewhere along the way, maybe in my late 30s, maybe earlier, I began to notice the hollowness. The prayers felt mechanical. I recited them perfectly, hit every syllable, made every prostration at the right moment. But inside? Nothing. Just echoes in an empty room. The sermons I delivered moved others to tears, yet I felt nothing while speaking them. I could preach about the mercy of God, while my own heart felt like stone. I could teach about peace, while tension coiled in my chest like wire. And the worst part? I couldn't tell anyone. Doubt, in my position, wasn't just weakness, it was treason. To question was to betray the legacy, the family, the entire structure that held me up. So I buried it. I performed my duties. I said the right words. I maintained the image. But every night, alone in my study, surrounded by books I'd memorized and honors I'd earned, I stared at the ceiling and felt the same gnawing question. Is this all there is? I preached certainty to thousands, while living with doubts I could never voice. I taught others how to find God, while He felt unreachable to me. I spoke about inner peace, while my soul felt restless as the wind. And I had no idea that the answer to my unspoken questions was already coming. It would arrive not through study or discipline or promotion, but through a prisoner I was sent to interrogate. A man named Arman, who sat calmly in an interview room and asked me the one question no one had ever dared to ask. The first report landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning in late January. It was a single page, bureaucratic, clinical, stamped with the seal of the Ministry of Intelligence. The subject line read, Incident Report, Unauthorized Religious Activity, District 6, Tehran. I almost didn't read it. These reports were common. Someone distributes pamphlets. Someone hosts an unauthorized gathering. Standard procedure. Investigate, warn, monitor. But this one was different. The subject was a taxi driver named Reja, age 42, no prior incidents, no radical affiliations. According to the report, he had suddenly stopped attending Friday prayers at his local mosque. When questioned by his imam, Reja said he'd met someone who offered him peace he'd never known. That was it. No manifesto. No organization. Just an encounter. I filed it away and moved on. Then came the second report. And the third. And by March, they were arriving weekly. A university student in Shiraz, who stopped wearing her hijab and told her family she'd had a dream. A retired Revolutionary Guard officer in Mashhad, who quit his position and started meeting with others in his apartment. A shopkeeper in Isfahan, who closed his store on Fridays to pray, but not in a mosque. The intelligence units called it religious contamination. They wanted containment protocols. They wanted names, networks, leaders. They assumed this was organized recruitment, foreign influence, Western propaganda seeping through the internet. But I read the reports differently. These weren't people being convinced by arguments. They weren't joining movements or following charismatic leaders. There was no centralized structure, no funding trail, no coordinated strategy. They were encountering something. Or someone. The testimonies had an unsettling consistency. A taxi driver in Tehran described waking at 3 a.m. to find his bedroom filled with light, not from lamps, but from a presence. He said a figure in white called him by name and spoke about forgiveness. A university girl in Qom wrote in her journal about a dream so vivid she couldn't shake it. She saw a man with kind eyes who told her she was loved not for her performance, but simply because she existed. A former soldier in Tabriz, a man who would committed acts in war he couldn't speak about, reported that one night his rage simply dissolved. He said peace fell on him like weight, and when he opened his eyes, he knew, somehow knew, that he'd been forgiven. Different cities, different backgrounds, different lives, but the same presence. And they all used the same name. Jesus. My initial response was clinical. This was my training kicking in. Analyze the pattern, identify the threat, neutralize the narrative. I treated it like any other investigation. Gather evidence, interrogate sources, find the logical explanation, dismiss the supernatural claims. I told myself, these were emotionally vulnerable people searching for meaning. Psychological phenomena. Shared delusions amplified by social media. Nothing more. But the reports kept coming. And the pattern kept holding. My superiors wanted action. They wanted a public response, sermons to discredit the movement, arrests to discourage the followers, a clear message that this would not be tolerated. So I did what I was trained to do. I began conducting interviews personally. Most were routine. Nervous people recanting under pressure. Confused individuals struggling to explain experiences they didn't fully understand. I documented everything, filed reports, moved on. Then I met Arman. Arman was brought into the interview room on a Thursday afternoon in early March. He wasn't what I expected. Most people summoned for these interrogations arrived terrified, eyes down, hands trembling, voices barely above a whisper. They pleaded innocence or begged for mercy before I even asked the first question. Arman walked in calmly, as if we were old friends meeting for tea. He was 34, a software engineer, well-educated, no criminal record. He'd been arrested for hosting small gatherings in his apartment, prayer meetings, the report said. Unauthorized religious activity. A dozen people had been attending regularly. I motioned for him to sit. He did, folding his hands on the table, his expression open and unguarded. Do you know why you are here? I asked. Yes, sir, he said quietly. Because I've been meeting with others who have encountered Jesus. No denial. No fear. Just honesty. I leaned back, studying him. You abandoned Islam. I didn't abandon God, he replied. For the first time in my life, God stopped feeling distant. Something in his tone unsettled me. There was no defiance, no rehearsed argument. Just peace. I pressed harder. Explain what happened. He didn't hesitate. I woke up one night 3 months ago. My room was filled with light, not from my window or my phone. It was warm, alive, like the air itself was glowing. I sat up, and I saw a figure standing near my bed. White, radiant, but gentle. And you weren't afraid? I asked, my pen hovering over my notepad. I should have been, Arman said. But I felt safe. Seen. Like every wall I'd ever built just dissolved. Then what? He spoke my name. Not my title. Not brother or son of so-and-so. Just Arman. And he said, I've been waiting for you. I wrote methodically, keeping my expression neutral. Then he told me that peace isn't something I earn. It's something I receive. That forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a gift. And when the light faded, I sat there until sunrise, crying harder than I've cried since I was a child. I looked up from my notes. And you believe this was real? Not a dream. Sir, Arman said, his eyes steady on mine, I've had dreams my whole life. This wasn't a dream. This was the first real thing I've ever experienced. I should have dismissed him. I should have written, psychological episode, in my report and moved on. But then he leaned forward slightly, and asked a question no prisoner had ever asked me before. Sir, when was the last time your prayers felt alive? The room went silent. I stared at him, my pen frozen mid-word. He wasn't mocking me. He wasn't accusing me. His voice was gentle, almost concerned. Like he genuinely wanted to know. I had no answer. Because the truth was, I couldn't remember. 10 years? 20? Maybe never? I ended the interview abruptly, stood, and left the room without another word. But his question followed me home. That night, I sat in my study surrounded by books I'd memorized and degrees I'd earned, and the walls felt smaller than they ever had. The silence pressed against my chest like weight. I tried to pray the way I always did, formal, structured, in Arabic. The words felt like dust in my mouth. So I did something I hadn't done in decades. I stopped performing. I sat in the darkness, alone, and spoke, not in the language of scholars, not in memorized verses, but in Farsi. In my own voice. From a place I'd buried so long ago, I'd forgotten it existed. God. I whispered, my hands trembling. If you are real beyond the rituals, beyond the systems and the titles and the prayers I've been repeating my entire life, show me. I waited. The room stayed dark. The silence stayed heavy. Nothing happened. I exhaled slowly, feeling foolish. What did I expect? A vision? A voice? I was a scholar, not a mystic. This was weakness, not faith. I went to bed assuming I'd lost my mind. 3 nights later, everything changed. I woke 3 nights later with my heart pounding so hard I thought I was dying. The clock on my nightstand read 3:47 a.m. My room was supposed to be dark, curtains drawn, door closed, city lights distant. But it wasn't. My bedroom glowed. Not from lamps. Not from the moon. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, warm and alive, like the air itself had become luminous. It didn't hurt my eyes. It didn't feel harsh or invasive. It felt gentle, present. I sat up slowly, every rational part of my mind screaming that this was impossible. Then I saw him. A figure stood near my window, white, radiant, but not blinding. The light emanated from him the way warmth radiates from fire, natural and undeniable. His presence filled the room without overwhelming it. I should have been terrified. I had interrogated people who described this exact moment, and I dismissed them as delusional. Now I was living it, and the only emotion flooding through me was safety. Not fear. Safety. Like I was being seen, truly seen, for the first time in my entire life. Then he spoke. Not loud. Not echoing. His voice was closer than my own thoughts, as if it bypassed my ears entirely and went straight to the deepest part of me. Farhad. Just my name. Not Dr. Nouri. Not esteemed scholar. Not council chairman. Farhad. Tears I didn't authorize began streaming down my face. I did not come to give you fear, he said, his voice carrying a tenderness I'd never heard in any sermon, any prayer, any teaching. I came to give you peace. My hands trembled against the bed sheets. He continued, and every word felt like it was unlocking something inside me that had been chained for decades. You have searched for God in systems and structures, in duties and disciplines. in titles and traditions. But peace is not earned, Farhad. It is received. I tried to speak, but my voice broke. You have carried the weight of perfection your entire life, he said. You have performed for approval, worked for worthiness, strived for a righteousness you could never achieve. But I did not come to add to your burden. I came to lift it. Something inside me cracked. 30 years of discipline. 30 years of striving. 30 years of performing faith while feeling empty. It all collapsed. Who are you? I whispered, though somehow I already knew. The answer was simple, clear, undeniable. I am Jesus. And I have not forgotten Iran. The room seemed to inhale. Everything I'd been taught said, this was impossible. Everything I'd built my life on said, this couldn't be real. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn God's attention. I was experiencing His presence. Forgiveness washed over me, not because I'd done enough, but because He'd done everything. Love wrapped around me, not conditional, not transactional, but absolute. Life flooded into places I didn't even know were dead. I wept like a child. Not out of shame. Not out of fear. Out of relief. I surrender, I whispered, the words spilling out before I could think them through. I don't know what this means. I don't know what happens next. But I surrender. The light didn't fade dramatically. It receded gently, like dawn breaking in rivers, until my room returned to its natural darkness. But I wasn't the same. I sat in my bed, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone new. My chest felt lighter. My mind felt clear. The restlessness that had haunted me for years, gone. Replaced by a peace so tangible it felt like a physical presence in the room. I stayed awake until sunrise, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. By the time light crept through my window, I knew three things with absolute certainty. Jesus was real. He had come for me. And nothing in my life would ever be the same. The weight of what this meant in Iran pressed down on me immediately. I was a senior religious scholar in an Islamic republic. I had just encountered the one name that could destroy everything I'd built. But for the first time in decades, I didn't care about protecting my position. I cared about protecting this peace. For 2 weeks, I lived in silence. I went through the motions, delivered sermons, attended meetings, reviewed reports, but inside, I was wrestling with a truth I couldn't speak and couldn't ignore. Every time I stood before congregations and recited familiar prayers, I felt like a fraud. Every time I advised officials on religious policy, the words tasted hollow. I had encountered something real, and now everything else felt like performance. But who could I tell? My colleagues would call it apostasy. My family would call it betrayal. The government would call it treason. In Iran, there is no safe space for a senior cleric to say, "I met Jesus." So I carried it alone, the weight of it growing heavier each day. Then came the announcement. On a Tuesday morning, I received a formal summons to the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. When I arrived, 3 senior officials sat waiting, their expressions grave but expectant. "Dr. Nouri," the director began, "the Supreme Council has approved a massive national gathering. A unity broadcast to strengthen religious confidence across the country. It will be held in Azadi Square on 18th April. I nodded, unsure why this concerned me. "We need a strong closing address," he continued. "Someone the people trust. Someone whose voice carries authority." He slid a folder across the table. "We've selected you." My hands went numb. "The topic is national stability and religious loyalty," another official added. "We need to address the rising unrest. Remind the nation of their foundation. reinforce their identity. I opened the folder. The speech outline was already written. Talking points, statistics, quotations, everything prepared. Everything except the truth. I accepted the assignment because refusing would have raised suspicion. But as I left the building, the irony hit me like a wave. 2 weeks after encountering Jesus, I was being given a national platform to defend the very system I now questioned. This wasn't coincidence. This was a setup, not from men, but from God. The next 12 days were the longest of my life. I barely slept. I couldn't eat. Every conversation felt layered with subtext I couldn't share. My wife noticed my distraction, but attributed it to work stress. My colleagues praised my selection, unaware of the war raging inside me. At night, I prayed, not the formal prayers of my position, but raw, desperate pleas. What do I do? If I speak, I lose everything. My family, my safety, my life. And every time, the same quiet response settled over me. I did not give you fear. I gave you peace. But peace didn't erase the cost. I thought about my father, whose entire legacy rested on my shoulders. I thought about my children, who would bear the shame of my choices. I thought about the colleagues who trusted me, the students who followed me, the nation that respected me. One sentence could destroy it all. Yet staying silent felt like betraying the only real thing I'd ever experienced. I drafted the approved speech a dozen times, trying to find a way to hint at truth without exposing it. But every version felt like cowardice. The conviction grew stronger each day. This platform wasn't given by coincidence. 150,000 people would be in that square. 500,000 watching on television. Cameras recording every word. Security monitoring every breath. If I was going to speak truth, this would be the moment. But the cost. I spent entire nights staring at the ceiling, weighing options that had no good answer. Safety versus integrity. Position versus calling. Legacy versus truth. Everything I'd built stood on one side. Everything I'd encountered stood on the other. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and calculation, a quiet voice kept whispering, "Peace to entire Iran." Not from systems. Not from control. But from the one who came searching for me in the darkness. The morning of 18th April arrived, whether I was ready or not. Dawn broke over Tehran like a held breath. I stood at my bedroom window watching light spread across the city, knowing that by sunset, nothing would be the same. The sky was cloudless, the air already warm. It would be a scorching day. Behind me, my wife moved quietly through the room, preparing tea she knew I wouldn't drink. She'd stopped asking if I was nervous. The answer was written all over me. At the breakfast table, my children ate in unusual silence. My oldest son, studying to follow in my footsteps, kept glancing at me with pride he didn't know was misplaced. My daughter, barely 16, asked if she could attend the gathering. I told her to watch from home. I kissed my wife longer than usual before leaving. She noticed but said nothing, just pressed her hand against my chest briefly, as if checking my heartbeat. "Be safe," she whispered. I nodded, unable to promise what I couldn't guarantee. The drive to Azadi Square felt both endless and too short. My security detail sat silent in the car, unaware they were escorting a man to his own potential execution. Through the tinted windows, I watched Tehran pass. Mosques, markets, ordinary people starting ordinary days. By the time we arrived, the square was already flooding with people. 150,000 bodies packed shoulder to shoulder across the massive plaza. Iranian flags rippled in the heat. Banners hung from buildings. Camera crews positioned themselves on elevated platforms. Drones hovered overhead like mechanical birds of prey. The noise hit me first. Voices, movement, energy, all of it converging on the central stage where I would stand. My security escort formed around me, cutting a path through the crowd. People reached out, trying to touch my robes, calling blessings I no longer felt worthy to receive. Their faces blurred together, workers in simple clothes, students with notebooks, mothers holding children, soldiers standing at attention. They trusted me. They expected me to reinforce everything they'd been taught, to strengthen what they already believed, to speak words that made them feel secure. And I was about to shatter that trust. The stage rose before me, draped in green and white, flanked by massive screens that would broadcast my face across the nation. Officials stood in crisp suits, nodding approvingly as I approached. Military helicopters circled overhead, rotors thumping rhythmically. Security cameras lined every tower, every angle covered. Every word would be recorded, every breath monitored. A staff member guided me to the podium and placed the prepared speech in front of me. 20 pages, typed, highlighted, approved. My safety net. My script. The words that would preserve everything. I stared at it without touching it. The crowd stretched endlessly before me. Faces upon faces upon faces. Workers who would taken the day off. Students who would traveled from other cities. Elderly men and women who remembered the revolution. Young people who knew nothing but the Islamic Republic. All waiting. All expecting. The announcer's voice boomed across the square, introducing my credentials, listing my positions, praising my decades of service. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause that rolled across the plaza like physical force. I stepped to the microphone. The applause faded into expectant silence. The script lay before me, untouched. Behind me, officials leaned forward, ready to hear words that would strengthen their control. Before me, 150,000 Iranians waited for truth they didn't know they needed. Above me, helicopters hovered, cameras recorded, the entire apparatus of state power monitored every breath. And inside me, something rose that 30 years of training, discipline, and fear could not stop. It wasn't courage. It was surrender. I gripped the edges of the podium, my hands trembling, and spoke the first words that would change everything. People of Iran. My voice echoed across the square, amplified through speakers, broadcast into 500,000 homes. I was asked to speak about strength. I paused, feeling the weight of what came next. But today, I speak about peace. People of Iran. I was asked to speak about strength. But today, I speak about peace. The crowd quieted instantly, a wave of silence rippling outward from the stage. I felt officials behind me shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the opening line they'd approved. But I couldn't stop now. For 30 years, I have served the Islamic Republic as a religious scholar, I continued, my voice steady despite my trembling hands. I have taught theology. I have delivered sermons. I have advised leaders and shaped policy. By every measure, I have been successful. Murmurs spread through the crowd. But I must confess something to you today. I paused, letting the weight settle. Inside, I have been empty. Powerful, yet hollow. Respected, yet restless. I preached peace while carrying tension. I taught certainty while living with doubt. The murmurs grew louder. Behind me, I heard footsteps, urgent whispers. I spent decades searching for God in rituals and duties, in systems and structures. But what I found was religion without life. Performance without presence. Security teams began moving along the stage perimeter. Camera operators zoomed in. Officials leaned toward each other, panic spreading across their faces. I pressed forward. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. My voice cracked slightly. 3 weeks ago, I encountered the peace I could never manufacture through discipline or devotion. The square fell into an airy stillness. I met Jesus. Gasps exploded across the crowd like thunder. Women covered their mouths. Men straightened in shock. Students stared with wide eyes. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Behind me, an official hissed, "Get him off the stage." But the microphone was mine, and the moment was now. I did not search for him, I said, tears streaming down my face without permission. He came searching for me. In the darkness of my bedroom, when I had nothing left to offer, he appeared. Not with condemnation, but with forgiveness. Not with political agenda, but with love. Not with fear, but with peace. My voice grew stronger. He spoke my name. Not my title. Not my position. Just Farhad. And he said, "I did not come to give you fear. I came to give you peace." Phones began lifting across the crowd. Fingers moved frantically across screens. Whispers raced from person to person like wildfire. For years, I taught that peace comes from obedience, from control, from following the right system perfectly. But I was wrong. I gripped the podium. Peace does not come from what we do. It comes from who we encounter. Security personnel moved closer, but something held them back. Maybe the cameras, maybe the crowd, maybe something else entirely. I lifted my eyes and looked across the sea of faces. Workers, mothers, students, soldiers, all of them carrying their own hidden emptiness, their own secret doubts, their own unspoken hunger. And I spoke the words that would circle Iran by nightfall. Peace to entire Iran. My voice broke but didn't stop. Not peace from systems that control you. Not peace from rituals that exhaust you. Not peace from religion that demands perfection you can never achieve. I paused, letting the weight of what came next fill my chest. But peace from a living God who still speaks, who still sees, who still comes searching for those who feel lost and empty and alone. For one breathless moment, no one moved. Then somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a woman began to cry, not quietly, but with deep, heaving sobs that carried across the square. Then another. Then a man near the front collapsed to his knees. Phones lifted higher. Videos recording. Messages sending. The truth spreading faster than officials could contain it. Behind me, chaos erupted. Officials shouted orders. Security teams received frantic instructions through earpieces. Before me, 150,000 Iranians stood frozen between what they'd been taught and what they'd just heard. And across the nation, in homes and shops and cafes, 500,000 people watching the broadcast sat in stunned silence as history shifted quietly beneath their feet. I didn't move from the podium. I had said what needed to be said. And for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't powerful. I was free. The moment after my last word, time seemed to fracture. Security personnel rushed the stage from both sides. Hands gripped my arms, not violently, but firmly, escorting me away from the microphone before I could say anything else. The crowd erupted into chaos, some shouting in anger, others weeping, many simply standing frozen in shock. As they pulled me toward the backstage area, I caught a glimpse of the massive screens. My face disappeared mid-broadcast, replaced by the Iranian flag and urgent commentary about technical difficulties. But it was too late. The words were already out. Inside the secure holding room, officials paced frantically, shouting into phones, demanding damage control protocols. Someone thrust my confiscated phone into my hands, and it immediately exploded with notifications. Hundreds of messages, missed calls, alerts flooding in faster than I could process. My brother, what have you done? A former student, Dr. Nori, are you safe? Unknown numbers, we heard you. We believe you. And mixed among them, threats I expected and messages I didn't. They said if I spoke from my heart instead of the script, I would disappear before sunset. They were probably right. But something inside me had fundamentally changed. The fear that should have paralyzed me felt distant, muted, like background noise I could acknowledge but no longer obey. I had spoken truth. Whatever came next, I had spoken truth. An official burst through the door, tablet in hand, face pale. "It's everywhere," he said, his voice tight with panic. "People recorded it on their phones. It's on social media. We are trying to block it, but..." "You can't," I said quietly. He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Or maybe I'd finally found it. Reports continued filtering in throughout the afternoon. Despite the broadcast being cut, the video was spreading like wildfire, shared through encrypted apps, uploaded to foreign servers, passed from phone to phone in markets and universities and coffee shops across Tehran. By evening, messages began arriving from people I'd never met. A university student in Mashhad. I had the same dream. I thought I was alone. A shopkeeper in Isfahan. You said what I couldn't. A mother in Shiraz. My son watched. He's asking questions I never thought he'd ask. The truth couldn't be contained once spoken. That night, when they finally allowed me to go home under heavy surveillance, my family waited in tense silence. My wife's eyes were red from crying. My children looked at me with a mixture of fear and something I'd never seen before. "Oh. They're saying you've destroyed us," my wife whispered. "I know," I said. "Was it worth it?" I looked at her, this woman who would stood beside me through decades of ambition and performance, and told her the only truth I had left. I finally met the God I've been preaching about my entire life. Yes. It was worth it. She didn't understand yet. But she would. The future was uncertain. Arrest seemed inevitable. My career was finished. My reputation shattered. Everything I'd spent 30 years building had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing. I wasn't striving. I wasn't carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't powerful. I was free. The cost was everything. The gain was life itself. As I sat in my study that night, monitoring reports of the testimony spreading across Iran and beyond its borders, I understood something profound. One testimony. 150,000 witnesses. Countless seeds planted in hearts that had been waiting for permission to hope. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Imprisonment? Probably. Exile? Possibly. Worse? Perhaps. But none of that could erase what had happened. Peace to entire Iran. It wasn't a wish anymore. It wasn't even just a declaration. It was a reality already unfolding, quietly, powerfully, unstoppably, in apartments and hearts and whispered conversations across a nation that had been told God was distant. The living God who came searching for me in my emptiness was now searching for them in theirs. And no amount of surveillance, censorship, or control could stop what he had already begun. I closed my eyes and whispered one final prayer, not in Arabic, not from memory, but from a heart that had finally learned to speak. Thank you for making me free.